My co-host and friend David Bonson has graciously yielded his time to the gentleman from California's Central Valley, farmer Dan Garawan. In this very special episode, Dan and I will discuss how his farm became the unlikely stage for the biggest farm worker rallies in decades. Demonstrations that, unlike those of yesteryear, have been organized by mostly Latino laborers against the once powerful United Farm Workers. You'll likely remember the UFW from its halcyon days in the 1960s and 70s when Cesar Chavez marched with priests and pop stars, including Bobby Kennedy and John Gregory Dunn, all there to focus public attention on the sometimes appalling conditions of life among our state's mostly immigrant agricultural workers. That movement was intertwined with Catholicism, the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Promise of America, and the long but vivid memory of Spanish and Mexican colonialism. It was, therefore, a very American protest. But as Max Weber once observed, revolutions follow a pattern. From a charismatic founder, they morph into routine government regulation and then into oppressive bureaucracies. And that's where Dan Garawan and his workers are today. They live in a kind of Kafkaesque setting, struggling with an alliance between Governor Jerry Brown's all-powerful Agricultural Labor Relations Board and the United Farm Workers. It is uniquely oppressive. And if it wins at Dan Garawan's family farm, it will actually reduce the pay and benefits of California's farm workers, also that union leaders and their allies in the State House can enhance their power. Here's our conversation. Dan Garawan, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So before we actually start with the beginning, I want to start with, I guess, the end, which is neatly summed up in a Wall Street Journal commentary on September 21st. We'll put this in the show notes, Dan. It starts and it ends really wonderfully. It says, workers at Dan Garawan's third-generation family farm in Fresno, California, voted 5 long years ago to decertify the United Farm Workers. Their ballots were finally counted last week following a tortuous battle that illustrates how liberal government often subjugates individual worker rights to union politics. According to the final ballot tally, workers had voted by a 5-1 margin to decertify the union. It's shameful that workers had to wait 5 years for this vindication, and their saga is another example of the often abusive power of big labor and government condominium. So, Dan, you lived this entire 5-year battle. And before we get into the details of that, I'd just like to give people some sense of I guess in some ways the battlefield was your own family farm, and then in another sense, as we'll discuss, it was really courtrooms and relatively obscure bureaucratic offices. But let's start with the farm. Can you tell us a bit about the history, I guess where your grandparents and parents were, where the farm is, and how it's changed over time?
Well, my father's family migrated in the Dust Bowl and started farming in California in the 1930s. My dad himself invested in his first peach orchard when he was about 17. He's in his 80s and still very active in the company. The company's operated by myself, my dad, my brother, and my wife. We're the nation's largest grower of fresh peaches, plums, and nectarines. Our fruit is marketed in the Prima brand, Prima. We've had a long history of being very close with our employees. I'm fully fluent in Spanish. They actually have my phone number. They call me. We're a large company, I guess, in the ag realm, but we're still operated very much like a family farm. This whole saga started sort of, I guess, in 1990 when the UFW won an election on our farm. But they never stuck around to negotiate. They literally disappeared, never came to the bargaining table, never tried to represent our employees in any way, never filed an unfair labor practice charge, never made any inquiries on behalf of our employees. Literally just disappeared for almost 20 years. Came back in 2012. I got a letter in my inbox, opened it up, said, "We are back. We represent your employees. And we're ready to negotiate."
What was your reaction when you saw this? I can imagine, but do you remember reading that? Like, what was your immediate reaction?
Well, it was almost surreal. I couldn't believe it was true. Contacted my dad and my brother. I said, "Have you guys heard anything?" They said, "No, I haven't heard anything for almost 20 years. Thought they were gone." contacted our attorneys, which explained that a law had passed in 2003 called Mandatory Mediation and Conciliation, MMC, that was essentially created because the UFW was unable to get contracts anymore. The employers at that time and UFW would negotiate, and no contract was reached. So the legislature decided that, well, if employees vote for a union, then they're voting for a contract. And if one can't be reached, then we'll jumpstart that with this extreme law that will allow the Ag Labor Board to literally write and impose contracts on workers and then the employer and jumpstart that relationship. Now, the Ag Labor Board comes from the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, which Jerry Brown touts as his crowning achievement of Jerry Brown 1.0. So given those circumstances, our attorneys explained to us, look, there's nothing we can do, that we're being entered into this new forced contracting system, and the timing was such that we were at the end of our season, so the UFW timed it so that our employees would not even be able to organize a vote.
Was there some complaint among your workers? Was the UFW responding to violations of worker rights?
No, quite the contrary. In fact, at a hearing that took place later, years later, a 105-day hearing, by the way, 8 to 5 each day, 5 days a week, paid for by the tax dollars. Both employees on both sides, both for the UFW and for Choice, said they had no idea that they were represented by UFW. Many of the employees were not even born when that vote took place. Maybe 1% of the employees remained from 1990. So no, and UFW wasn't pretending that they were called in for any particular reason. I think they just figured, well, we've got this law from 2003. They updated a little bit in 2011. They said, well, we're ready to do this. There was a new prosecutor at the Ag Labor Board. The Ag Labor Board being the ALRB, which is the California Ag version of the National Labor Relations Board. And so they embarked on this massive plan, and we can say it's a massive plan now because looking back, that this was all engineered and planned at the time. And the idea was that they were going to force us into a UFW contract and our employees. And in one fell swoop, overnight, the UFW size would have been doubled overnight. That's how small UFW had become. And the majority of UFW members at that point would have been co-opted members who never had a choice and never voted to be in that union.
So you're pointing at what I find the sort of material interest of the union here, which I'm just going to say pretends to be defending worker rights, and in fact, in this case, comes in after an absence of about 2 decades and demands each of your employees pay 3% of his or her wages to the union. And as you point out, that would double their membership and perhaps even double or more their income. So they have an incentive to do this, I suppose.
Well, they have a big incentive. First of all, they had expenses exceeding their income by over $1 million. That's based on public filings. And our employees were one way for them to finally try to get financially stable. And don't forget, when they came in 2012, our employees had already had a long history of earning the industry's highest wages. UFW's message to them was quite clear. We're here. You won't have a choice. Get over it. And by the way, if you don't pay us, you will lose your jobs. So these are employees who had never before had to pay for their work and never before had to keep their jobs, and are suddenly being told that they're going to have to pay to keep their jobs and that they will not have a choice. There will be no vote, they were told.
Now, those of us who live in California and pay attention to such things know that union propaganda requires that they insist that employers, whether it's a government employer like a fire authority or a city council, are bad, and they want to destroy the working class. And similarly, for those of us who have followed your drama there in the Central Valley, we heard the same thing. We read the same thing from the UFW, that farmers are rich and greedy and bad, and they accused you of fomenting this rebellion. Because when the workers hear about this 3% of their wages, they're They don't know who this group is, and they're upset. And do you remember how they initially responded? Because I just read stories later that showed that they had a pretty clear grasp of the fact that this was a shakedown. Do you remember specifically what employees said when they found out?
They did have a very clear grasp of what was going on. And no, we did not foment this at all. We didn't have to. UFW did that themselves with their message. Pay to keep your jobs from now on, or you're fired.
And that is that's really how they put it to the employees.
That's exactly what they were told. And our messages to our employees were very clear, vetted by our attorneys to make sure we didn't break any rules, and we simply kept them informed of exactly what was going on. The UFW timed this so that our employees would not be able to do a decertification election. However, apparently UFW dragged their feet before they put us into the mandatory contracting process, and the employees erupted. They erupted thousands strong. In fact, the largest farm labor protests in this state's history have been on our farm the last few years. All of those protests against the government and against the union, never against us. And in fact, Will, those protests themselves were used as evidence, quote unquote, by the labor board to destroy the employees' votes later. They said, for example, when one morning we had a massive peach harvest and our employees decided to go out on strike by the thousands and take to the streets, when we had a crop to pick, they said we should have punished our employees for doing that protest. And that was one of the reasons that they wanted to destroy the ballots, because of that, quote, unfair labor practice of us not punishing our employees for taking to the streets.
So I want to be, in case the obvious irony is lost on anybody, I just want to be clear. The UFW and or their auxiliaries in the state agricultural labor relations board, they wanted you to punish workers for striking, I guess because the strike was really in their own defense rather than and not for the union.
Exactly. And they wanted us to punish them for a bus trip that they took to Sacramento that we had nothing to do with, but 400 of them took a trip to Sacramento to visit the labor board. The labor board came back and said, look, Growan, you should have punished them for doing this. They should not have been able to walk off their jobs and take buses to Sacramento to visit us, the board. For failing to punish them, that's yet another reason their votes should be destroyed.
Reminds me of the old folk song. Is it Pete Seeger? Which side are you on? It sounds like the UFW's not on the side of the workers so much as its own self-interest.
Unquestionably. And don't forget, when you mentioned that the ALRB and UFW, they are so close to be, for example, the current regional director of the ALRB here in the Fresno area was a 14-year veteran VP of UFW, okay? The best man at his wedding was Cesar Chavez. He currently oversees the ALRB that's supposed to be a neutral arbiter between farm workers and employers and the union. He's hardly that. Many of the ALRB operatives, two of them got their law degrees at a particular program at internship program at UFW, did not go to law school, literally got their law degrees from UFW, and then Jerry Brown appoints them to ALRB to be so-called neutral arbiters.
So the workers finally got their vote. I shouldn't say finally. They vote in 2013, and I guess literally the ballots are locked up, and this is where the 5-year court battle takes place, with the UFW arguing that anything it can, I suppose, to deny the right of these people to have their votes counted.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the night before that vote, literally at midnight the night before the vote, the regional director at ALRB emailed our attorneys and said, UFW doesn't like about 600 of the Growan workers, thinks that they are plants. So therefore, as these 600 workers arrive at the polls tomorrow, we are going to interrogate them. And they proceeded to do that. As the 600 Latino immigrant farm workers arrived at the polls, they were herded aside, asked for 2 forms of ID by ALRB, and then interrogated. Those 600 ballots were challenged and put in a separate envelope. So the vote count that happened recently, the reason they challenged those was because the regional director figured, well, if somehow these ever get counted, I'll have 600 to mess with the election and will destroy the election that way. Well, problem was the employees were so against UFW and so in favor of having a choice that not even those 600 challenge ballots saved it for them, for the ALRB and UFW.
So they lock these ballots up, and then a state judge orders them counted last week, right?
The judge ordered them counted in July, I believe. That was three judges. A three-judge panel unanimously ordered ALRB to count those ballots. The ALRB then appealed that decision to the California State Supreme Court. Keep in mind that the California State Supreme Court about a year ago also came out with a ruling, a unanimous ruling, that forced contracts in agriculture are constitutional. It was shocking ruling.
Just to be clear, you said they are constitutional or unconstitutional?
Constitutional. That was the state Supreme Court that said that, yes, it was quite a shock. They essentially justified this by saying, look, it's okay if the labor board writes and forces contracts on workers and employers because, well, workers can decertify if they want. So when we had this decision out of the Court of Appeals saying that our employees' ballots should be counted, I think the state Supreme Court looked at that appeal to them and said, look, there's nothing we can do with this. We already said these employees can decertify if we want. We certainly can't come in behind that and say, unless we destroy the votes. So the order stood because the California Supreme Court refused to accept the appeal, and within days later, finally, the ALRB had to count those votes.
So they count the votes, and as I read from the Wall Street Journal commentary, 5-1 margin to decertify the union. What did that mean in an actual practice? Like, do you walk out on your farm and do you see a difference? Do the workers have a different experience of their labor today?
Not exactly. This legal saga has been going on for so many years, and it continues, Will. It's not over yet. The ALRB and UFW persist in their desire to have the election thrown out. So there's still more briefing to do on this before, in fact, the employee's choice actually takes hold. The employees themselves have been living this for so long, it's not as though there's one particular incident now that's going to change how they work or feel. They've gone through a long, really civil rights struggle and achieved something that is really impressive. I would think it's a very American result, fighting for their right to choose, and all they wanted from the start was the same right that every other worker in California has.
I'm intrigued by the image, as you said earlier, about these are the largest protests in California agriculture, for this last decade or more. I'm just sort of intrigued by the romance of that because, back in the 60s, we would have seen this as an eruption of worker freedom and equality. And today we hear very little about this, except through the megaphone of, most of the mainstream media. I have to say that a lot of what I've read is fairly balanced. But the ALRB, the UFW's response to this is just to crush it Soviet style.
Exactly. They've not even tried to endear themselves to the employees as in any way being neutral, nor has the UFW, because they can't. They've made it very clear from the start they don't want our employees to have a choice. And they've made it clear, Will, from the start, from the fact that a contract literally was written by ALRB. The ALRB has 3 board members appointed by Jerry Brown. There could be 5. He only appointed 3. And they literally wrote a labor contract, wages and all, and tried to force it on our employees. And when they tried to do that, I'll never forget this. I walked into the courthouse in Fresno. There are literally 1,000 of our employees outside protesting. Inside the courtroom, an ALRB attorney was telling the judge, "Your Honor, we want to impose this on those workers." It's almost surreal. But this, and they have not given up on that yet. They still want to force this so-called contract on our workers, despite the fact, and it is a fact, this contract, had it been imposed on our employees, would have lowered their take-home pay. Yes, the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, whose mission it is to protect worker rights, wanted a contract forced on our employees that would lower their pay. UFW did too. It was to line UFW's pockets.